Hello everyone, I'm the Enforcer, and welcome to the breaking news. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and support us on Patreon, link in the description below. Today we have breaking news from every corner of the world, as we've been able to hear that the Ukrainian armed forces have conducted another major drone attack onto the Russian Federation overnight, comprising of hundreds of drones, hitting areas such as the city of Kursk and others throughout the Russian Federation. Meanwhile, we've also been able to hear of precise Ukrainian artillery strikes on Russian supply and ammunition caches around the city of Kursk, as it appears that the Ukrainian armed forces are still attempting to destabilize the Russian attacking forces within that front. We have also been able to hear of significant news in American developments in the Middle East, as it appears that more U.S. supplies and equipment continues to be moved into the area as U.S. military buildups continue to persist. Meanwhile, the U.S. has been conducting diplomatic negotiations with the Islamic Republic of Iran over the possible idea of denuclearization, and it appears that the results are incredibly mixed, as last night there were reports coming out that we were going to be entering a nuclear deal with the Iranians, similar to the one that was agreed to in 2015 by a prior U.S. president, and now today we are hearing that there has been a complete reversal, as the U.S. diplomatic delegation is now demanding a complete denuclearization of Iran once more. This is coming as the United States is stating that all U.S. forces will be withdrawn from Syria by the 2-month mark from this point today. We have also been able to hear that the trade war with China is continuing, as the People's Republic of China has now stated that they will not be shipping in any further Chinese-made U.S. aviation parts for aircraft inside the United States. Chinese airlines will not be allowed to receive any Boeing aircraft or any aircraft produced by other aircraft manufacturers inside of the United States into the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, we are hearing different reactions to the Sumy massacre that occurred on Sunday, as the French are stating that there should be a universal condemnation and further sanctioning of the Russian Federation, while the United States of America is now saying that they will not condemn the Sumy attacks because they are wanting to continue talks with the Russians. This is quite clear and obvious at this point that the Russian Federation is a wonderful country that we should be continuing to talk to. We are, of course, going to be covering all of this news and a little bit extra over the course of this video. And so moving on into the most significant part of the news that we were able to get today, we were able to hear of the massive attack on Kursk. Around 30 explosions independently were heard throughout the city of Kursk, and it appears that a large amount of these drones were attempting to attack military infrastructure. We do understand that some of the drones were shot down by the limited Russian air defense around the city of Kursk, but for the large part, most of the drones did manage to make it through. This video right here is showing one of the debris fields of a drone that hit onto the side of a building, but there are other videos showing the actual explosions of drones as they impacted their targets throughout the city of Kursk. We do understand that a large amount of Ukrainian drones were sent into the Russian Federation overnight, with around 150 to 170 reported. So far, we do understand that around 30 of those targeted the city of Kursk, but so far, we have not been able to amalgamate or gather the information on where the other drones went and what they were targeting and what kind of damage may have been caused. Nevertheless, it does appear that the armed forces of Ukraine are continuing their significant attacks against the Russian Federation in hopes that the Russians will not be able to continue on their war due to the significant amount of damage to their war efforts and also their military industrial abilities. We have also been able to hear inside the area of Relist, the Ukrainian armed forces near to the Kursk front are continuing bombardments of Russian munitions and munitions and supply caches around the area, including this one inside of Relist, which we can see on this clip right here.
Только что взрыв был.
We can hear the pops of ammunition coming from the fire in the distance.
Ого, нормально так.
The audio then mutes in the last few seconds. But it is quite clear that the Ukrainian armed forces were able to hit a small ammunition cache within the center of Relist, once again showing that the Russian Federation has been put into a minor backfoot in the area. So far, we do understand that the Russian Federation is actually using Koronivo as their major supply base, but it does appear that supplies in transit to Koronivo were hit inside of Relist and there was some damage caused. One thing that is a little bit concerning about this, however, is that the ammunition cache was in the middle of a populated, settled area, such as a small town. If this explosion was to create a large fireball, it is highly likely that it could kill dozens of civilians in the city streets due to the Russians' storage of munitions quite literally within the middle of the city. It is also a little bit interesting to see that the Ukrainians also struck this munitions facility, although at this point the Ukrainian armed forces are largely left with an ultimatum. Now that we have confirmed through that video that there was a great deal of munitions stored there, the Ukrainians can either not hit it and let that ammunition be fired at the Ukrainians, or they can and let Russian incompetence play out in its own right and hit the munitions in the middle of the city. A little bit of a tough moral perspective there, but nevertheless a reality of warfare at some times. Nevertheless, it does appear that the Ukrainian armed forces were able to hit the ammunition and supply cache and were able to ensure that the Russian Federation will not have the kind of abilities that it has had in the past to be able to conduct a large amounts of fire on the Ukrainians through artillery forces in the Kursk direction and continue to keep them suppressed, at least because of that one ammunition fire. Meanwhile, moving on from that and on into Moscow, we've also been able to see something that's a little bit interesting that is starting to blur the lines in between what are Russian civilian targets and military targets, or in short, what is on the menu and what is not on the menu for Ukrainian armed forces to strike. Many people do know that the city of Moscow is the largest city in the Russian Federation, home to about 10 to 11 million people, or about approximately 10% of the entire population of the Russian Federation. A large amount of the most built-up areas of Moscow are actually from this small little area here, which comprises a few city blocks. This area is known as the Moscow City Center, or what we largely call the Propaganda Village. The Propaganda Village does not look at all like the surrounding areas, and we can drop y'all down on Street View here to show y'all. This is what the surrounding areas of Moscow look like. It looks about equivalent to Detroit or somewhere similar, but the Moscow City area is truly unique and very nice. As you can see here, this is what the Moscow City area looks like. Billions of dollars, as a matter of fact, hundreds of billions of dollars were invested by the Russian Federation into building this area up so that way it could be used for propaganda purposes towards the Western world, so that way a large amount of pictures could be taken of this area, and then they could go, wow, Moscow is so nice and the West is so far behind. The West clearly is not a first world country because we are. Meanwhile, literally just about a block or two away from that, you can see the absolute squalor that still remains literally right outside of the view of the skyscrapers of the Moscow City area. Nevertheless, the Russian Federation, while using this for propaganda, has also decided to use it for another purpose, which is to actually, crazily enough, operate their military drones out of the buildings in the skyscraper. This guy is in a skyscraper in the Moscow City Financial District, the one that I just showed you all from the ground, and he is operating Russian military drones that are being used in the Ukraine war right now from one of the rooms inside of this skyscraper. This video was only on Russian media for approximately 6 hours before it was removed, but it gave us a little bit of an insight into the Russian Federation and the way that they've been conducting warfare for some time. The Ukrainian armed forces, whenever conducting drone warfare like this, largely conduct it from a secure building or bunker a good ways away from a populated area, and usually just a couple of dozen miles away from the front lines, meaning that if the Russians were to find out where those Ukrainians were, they would be striking that facility, possibly killing military personnel and destroying their abilities to conduct warfare with the drones, but they wouldn't be conducting any kind of civilian collateral. This Russian right here is in the middle of an actual skyscraper that is filled with tenants that actually are civilian businesses that are conducting business as usual. This guy is putting everyone at risk because with this guy being in this building, interestingly enough, he is largely creating a military target out of the entire skyscraper. The Ukrainians start to get a bit of a blank check at this point if their rules of engagement are fairly loose, and usually at this point they are, to be able to hit this building in any way, shape, or form that they need to be able to try and knock this one drone operator out. And this is starting to blur the lines in between what are military targets and what are civilian targets, or largely what is on the menu and what is off the menu, as the Russians are now using entire skyscrapers filled with tens of thousands of Russian civilians pretty much as a shield for them to conduct drone operations such as these. The entire clip largely just shows the guy speaking about his operations inside of the skyscraper and how they are knocking out the Ukrainians from the comfort of one of the Moscow City skyscrapers. But once again, the video was removed, most likely after the Russians started to realize that this would start to give the Ukrainians at least a blank check to start flinging long-range drones right into the area of Moscow City, and there really wouldn't be a bad way to paint it, because the Ukrainians technically would be attempting to hit military targets inside of Moscow City. Nevertheless, the damage was most likely already done, as it's quite obvious that the guy was in one of those those skyscrapers. There's only one area in the Russian Federation that actually has skyscrapers, funnily enough, of any large density, and that is this area, the Moscow City area. So once again, it appears that the Russians are showing that they really do not try and make a distinction between civilians and military personnel. They actually try and blend them together so that way they can try and make it look like the Ukrainians may have attempted to attack a civilian target instead of a military one. Meanwhile, moving on from that and into the Middle East, we have been able to hear of some significant developments inside the Middle East in between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran as the days have gone by. While diplomatic negotiations are ongoing, we have been able to see that a large amount of transports have been continuing from Europe and into the Indo-PACOM area to the CENTCOM region, which would be the Middle East for the United States, as a large amount of the U.S. Air Force's Air Mobility Command, or AMC, which is a movie theater company here in the United States, continues with no end in sight. Since the 22nd of March of this year, over 300 C-17s, C-5s, C-130s, KC-135s, and KC-46s linked to AMC have arrived at air bases across the U.S. CENTCOM's area of responsibility, likely pre-positioning air defense systems, equipment, and other defensive assets in the region for the continued possibility of a conflict with Iran. That is still going on as of today, and we are continuing to see the United States Armed Forces are continuously staging themselves for what appears to be a possible future conflict with Iran. While we are preparing for this possible future conflict with Iran, there have been some very interesting diplomatic developments going on in between the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Ones that I will have to entirely say I'm not a fan of whatsoever, and I'll explain why here in a second, but let me get y'all through the news first. First, we've been able to hear that the United States has given some nuclear proposals to Iran through the Witkoff delegation, which I have to say has to be the most incompetent one at this point that I've heard of, but nevertheless, the U.S. is proposing to transfer Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium to a third-party country, such as the Russians. According to The Guardian, Iran is expected to resist the proposal, according to the report, and the issue is seen as a key stumbling block to a future agreement. More importantly, however, Witkoff, the head of our U.S. delegation right now, went on to Fox News last night with Sean Hannity and stated that they actually were not going to be stopping the Iranians from having a nuclear program. Oh no. Actually, we are very strong under the current administration and the Witkoff delegation because as our strong positioning, according to what he was saying last night, Witkoff, he stated, and I wish I could show the clip, but it's a Fox News clip, so it's copyrighted. He stated that we're pretty much going to be bringing back the 2015 U.S.-Iran Obama-era deal, where the Iranians will be allowed to have nuclear technology as long as they only use it for peaceful means, and as long as we kind of get to take a little gander at it with U.S. nuclear inspectors. That is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. That original nuclear agreement was highly weak, and it largely counted on the Iranians acting in good faith and showing us every single facility that was operating at a nuclear level or a nuclear research and development level. It was a very weak agreement. The next president after Obama, which made the original agreement in 2015, I'm sure many of y'all knew who the next president was, ripped up the deal and then did nothing else to stop the Iranians from developing a nuclear weapon. The last president did absolutely nothing to stop them from developing a nuclear weapon. So now we're back around, and right now we've heard from U.S. intelligence, and the Iranians have even stated that they are getting incredibly close to fielding and using an actual nuclear weapon, and they're doing it because of national security reasons, because they believe that the United States cannot be trusted and that we will invade them in the future. We are now going to make an agreement with them, at least according to what we were hearing last night, that is literally verbatim the exact same weak agreement that we had in 2015. This is absolutely ludicrous and not in America's interest. I don't know whose interest this is in, but this is once again paramount to appeasement in the Middle East if that was followed through on. We are now seeing that the United States of America is even scared to go up against the Islamic Republic of Iran when Russia and China have both made it clear that they're going to sit back and watch us beat the Iranians around if we went into a full-on war with them. No one wants to come to the aid of Iran. No one wants to help them out. They're entirely on their own right now, and they are entirely on their own while they have been publicly shouting that they're creating a nuclear weapon. If you do not believe me on that, just go and pull up, is Iran creating a nuclear weapon? There's Khamenei saying, at least in two specific instances, that they are, and the U.S. isn't going to stop them. So now we are going to try and get this weak, limp noodle strategy that we had in 2015 and pretty much re-implement it onto the Iranians, which tells them, this is what it tells them. You can enrich uranium, so you can have uranium enrichment facilities, which is key to producing a nuclear weapon, but you can only enrich to 3.67%, which is incredibly close to nuclear grade uranium. And and who's to say that they wouldn't just enrich it a little bit farther than 3.67% and actually have nuclear weapons grade uranium ready to go at any given moment? They can also use nuclear energy for peaceful means as well, meaning that they will have to be able to enrich their own uranium, and they will always have a decent amount of nuclear fuel sitting around somewhere inside of their country. But this is all precipitated that the United States of America has to be allowed a couple of nuclear inspectors into the country hither and thither, so that way they can go around to the nuclear facilities we know of, not the ones that the Iranians will hide from us, but only the ones that we know of, to make sure that it doesn't look like anything sketchy is going on in a nuclear power plant, like they're building a little boy in the middle of the reactor building. That is what the current agreement sounds like, and it is absolutely insane. But we have been able to hear that now, as of this morning, there's been a complete change in the U.S. diplomatic delegation stance, as now Witkoff has done a magic 180. But this is nothing really new at this point. But to give you all a little bit of a summary, you can also see the tweet right down here, which this is the Office of the Special Envoy to the Middle East. That's the exact statement from the ambassador, the diplomatic envoy. The White House Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, has now walked back his comments last night on Fox News that described a conceptual Iran proposal eerily reminiscent of the failed Obama-era JCPOA Iran deal framework. About an hour ago, Ambassador Witkoff returned to the current administration's previous sentiments on the process, saying that Iran must stop and eliminate its nuclear enrichment and weaponization program. To really quickly read you all the tweet in its entirety, this is a full quote that was provided by Ambassador Witkoff. A deal with Iran will only be completed if it is a current president's deal. Any final arrangement must set a framework for peace, stability, and prosperity in the Middle East, meaning that Iran must stop and eliminate its nuclear enrichment and weaponization program. It is imperative for the world that we create a tough, fair deal that will endure, and that is it's what the president has asked me to do. Largely, we do not know what's going on at this point. To be entirely honest with you all, there's hardly any of this negotiation that's being publicized at this point about what we're really saying and what we're really doing with the Iranians in Oman, where the negotiations are currently being held. But at least based off of the statements last night, which went into far greater depth than the simple tweet went into this morning, it appears that the United States is moving towards implementing another weak nuclear deal with the Iranians. And if that is the case, that is ridiculous. The Islamic Republic of Iran has clearly made itself out to be an enemy of the United States through multiple decades. They support and sponsor terrorist forces throughout the entirety of the region, including Hezbollah and Hamas near Israel, and also the Yemeni Houthis inside of Western Yemen. They are constantly attempting to destabilize governments whenever and wherever they can. They are a serious threat to the United States and also our control of the Middle East, which is crucially imperative over these next 2 decades as we see that the world will continue its slow and gradual transition away from fossil fuels and into some other forms of fuel sources. We have to be able to maintain complete control of the world's majority of fossil fuel resources during that time for strategic imperative reasons, to ensure that the Chinese do not have access to cheap and limitless amounts of expendable fossil fuels. With this in mind, the Iranians pose a major threat, and not only that, they are openly violating, at least for the past few months, publicly by their own accord, the nuclear non-proliferation treaties, as they have been stating that they have been working towards a nuclear weapon and that it is getting very close to being completed. For these reasons alone, and also due to the fact that the Iranians have already made it very clear they're creating a nuclear weapon because they don't trust the United States, going into a deal with them is absolutely asinine. They still will not trust the United States, and they will still secretly work on developing a nuclear weapon because they will only be a few small steps away. If this deal is implemented, they will be able to enrich their own uranium, they will be able to house their own uranium, they will be able to largely transport uranium fuels around the country in the prospects of nuclear energy and peaceful nuclear technology, but in the entire meantime, they could still be working on developing an actual nuclear weapon. And that means that if they have a nuclear weapon, or if they develop one in the middle of this treaty and they actually test it, this is all over. They're going to be a nuclear armed power from then on until the end of time, and our deal will have meant nothing. It would be far better at this point to be aggressive with the Iranians and to go in and actually take military action against them to denuclearize them than go into some sort of a limp noodle deal that is going to see us once again absolutely get shafted in the Middle East by poor policy decisions and a weak spine. We need to have a stronger spine in these kinds of times because the Islamic Republic of Iran is a country that out of any should not have a nuclear weapon for sure. Moving on from that, though, we have been able to hear in the meantime that the United States has begun the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Syria, and in around 2 months' time, all U.S. Forces will have been withdrawn. U.S. forces are not in a large amount of areas inside of Syria. There is a small spackling of U.S. special forces within the northeast of the country, and there's also a larger At-Tanf garrison perimeter that's been created around the area of the At-Tanf garrison, which you can actually see right up here. That is the garrison itself. But nevertheless, we have seen that U.S. forces' presence in the area has only been in the several thousands. All of those forces will be withdrawn, however, within the next 2 months, as the United States of America is finally removing itself from the final chapters of the Syrian civil war and the ongoing tumult in Syria, now that the interim government, led by the Tahrir al-Sham, or the Tahrir al-Sham, has been put into power inside of Syria. Moving on from the Middle East, though, we have been able to hear that the trade war between the United States and China is continuing, as the Chinese have now ordered its airlines to not take any further deliveries of Boeing aircraft, and we've also been able to hear that the Chinese, who do produce civilian aircraft parts for U.S. manufacturers like Boeing, have completely stopped all exports of those aviation parts from China to the United States, which may pose aviation issues moving on into the future, as a large amount of American aircraft do count on those spare parts to be able to keep their fleets running. So we may see that there are some larger issues as a result of that if this trade war continues on. Moving on from that, however, and on into some other news about a more morbid and darker topic that happened a couple of days ago, actually. Many people do know and have been speaking greatly about the Sumy massacre that was conducted about 2 days ago and has been deemed by some to be the Palm Sunday massacre, as 2 ballistic missiles fired by the Russian Federation landed inside of the direct city center of Sumy, exploding inside the streets and killing dozens of people. This attack has faced a large amount of international condemnation by many, as it seemed to be a direct and open attack by the Russians onto the Ukrainian citizenry and has been described as nothing less of a small genocide. This massacre has actually gotten a lot more press and attention than other massacres in the past, which I've had the great misfortune of hearing about and having to cover sometimes here in the channel many, many years ago. There were actually 2 massacres that came to my mind that were larger than this one and really got absolutely no press attention compared to the attack that occurred right now inside of Sumy. And that would be the Kharkiv attack and the Kramatorsk attacks of years prior. In fact, the Kharkiv attack was so long ago, I can't even remember the exact time it actually occurred. It was sometime in 2023, but beyond that, my memory is absolutely shot on the exact moment in time that it happened. Nevertheless, there were about 50 Ukrainians standing outside, queuing in a line near to a store to be able to receive government rations of food, considering that the food supply in Kharkiv had been heavily disturbed. They were on a rationing regimen at the time, and a Russian ballistic missile landed square in the parking lot that these people were queued in and killed about 50 of them outright and injured many dozens more. It was an absolute depraved sort of an act by the Russian Federation. It produced far more casualties than the attack that we saw in Sumy, and nevertheless, really the only people that mentioned it were people here on YouTube, like my channel, and maybe 2 others, and then it was completely ignored by the majority of many other people. There was a real significant one that happened very early on in the war that still sticks in my mind to this day. It was one of the first things that I'd seen that really stuck with me to the point that I had a couple of nightmares about it from that point on, but that would be the Kramatorsk railway station massacre that occurred in the latter part of 2022 or during the middle part of 2023. I'm not entirely sure when it was, but it was around that time frame on the earlier side of the war. But during that time, the Russian Federation was conducting the Battle of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which would certainly place that towards the middle part of 2023, I do believe. But nevertheless, they were conducting the battles of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and it appeared that Kramatorsk and Slavyansk may eventually get close to being a frontline area. Loads of Ukrainian civilians had flooded to the Kramatorsk railway station within the central area of Kramatorsk and had started to stand stand along the railway platforms, waiting for the next train to come by and pick them up and bring them out the area. At that exact moment in time, a Tochka-U short-range ballistic missile fired by the Russian Federation landed square center of the railway platform, right in the dead center of the actual railway station. The resulting shrapnel and explosion killed about 50 or so people. A large amount of those people were children, around 20 of them or so. And the absolute visuals of that massacre were absolutely gut-wrenching. They were terrifying. And still to this day, I've had a couple of nightmares and still remember vividly a couple of the pictures that came out from that massacre. And that massacre got some media attention, but it was hardly anything, and it was hardly at all any attention compared to the Sumy massacre, although in reality, both the Kramatorsk and the Kharkiv massacre ended up killing more people that the Russian Federation had a direct hand in. For some reason, the Sumy massacre is getting far more attention, possibly because we are currently involved in attempted peace negotiations with the Russian Federation when it happened. Nevertheless, I still feel like a lot of people should remember that while this massacre is the most recent one, and is of course incredibly graphic and absolutely disturbing that the Russian Federation would conduct an attack like that, what is the crazy thing about it is that it pales in comparison to massacres that happened in the past, and I would like for people to try and remember those a little bit, because those people who died in those prior massacres were as innocent a victim as the current victims of this massacre in Sumy. Nevertheless, a lot of people have been bringing a great deal of attention, including global governments, to an unholy degree, at least compared to the prior massacres, to this one in particular in Sumy. And we have been able to hear that the French government is calling for a new round of sanctions by the European Union against the Russian Federation for what they are now deeming the Palm Sunday massacre. According to the French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot, Ukraine has been agreeing to a ceasefire for over a month. Putin clearly has no intention of moving in that direction. That is why he must be forced to do so, once again arguing for further sanctioning. France is also a member of the G7, which is the largest economic alliance in the world, and it comprises of nothing but Western aligned countries that are of a significant economic note. Those countries include the state of Japan, the French Republic, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the Federal Republic of Germany, the United States of America, the Commonwealth of Canada, and a couple of other countries, I believe. I may have missed a couple of my count there. I believe South Korea is included. But nevertheless, all of these countries have been coming together to create a unified, universal condemnation by the G7 against the Russian Federation for the absolute abhorrent massacre that occurred in Sumy on Sunday. The only country that is not going to be that is not going to be a part of that universal condemnation by the G7, and it is actually the largest member of the G7, is the United States of America, as we are now stating that we will not be condemning the attack by the Russians on the citizens of Sumy, because we do not want to upset the ongoing talks with Moscow. That is a pretty new low right there to me, in my opinion. I feel like a massacre of civilians generally should be condemned even if you're in peace talks, because it is simply the moral principle of it that innocent civilians were targeted and killed en masse by the Russians in a deliberate attack that was really for no reason. There was really no good justification or reason for the attack that occurred in Sumy by the Russian Federation onto that city. And nevertheless, the United States will not come out and condemn that attack because we are wanting to continue peace talks with the Russians. As a matter of fact, there was a very weak statement made by the U.S. Secretary of Defense only hours after that attack occurred on Sunday, where the not the Secretary of Defense, but the Secretary of State of the United States actually stated that because the Russians have killed dozens of innocent civilians, that is actually why we should talk to the Russians even more to try and secure this peace. I would argue the opposite. I would say that due to that, we should start talking less with the Russians, because it's quite clear that while we're giving them the widest breadth possible to create an actual peace, they are continuing on with the instruments and actings of war that only an absolutely despotic and wicked sort of a country could ever come across with. I've never seen a country that has been involved in peace negotiations go out of its way to mindlessly slaughter dozens of civilians in the middle of a major city like Sumy, and then instead of us saying that that's clearly showing that they have no intention to move towards peace, we're actually going to say that that in fact is a bigger reason for us to have a dialogue with them and talk with them about peace. I would say that once the Russians stop massacring civilians in the droves, then we might be able to have some peace talks with them. But for now, I think it would be a far greater imperative to stop peace talks with them and further support the Ukrainian armed forces so that they can beat the Russians down economically and militarily enough that they actually will take peace negotiations seriously, instead of us just running running around like fools over here and acting like the Russians really want a peace when they clearly keep showing by every single action, including that massacre, that peace is the last thing on their minds. But nevertheless, that is all the major news that we have today. I have to thank each and every one of y'all once again for watching. And while the end of this video was on a bit more of a serious and grave topic, such as the Sumy massacre, I hope that our news coverage is still well researched and well informed, and that y'all get a good deal of information out of it, even if that information isn't the greatest sounding information like we're getting right now. If you did enjoy this news summary, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you would like to help us to be able to keep these kinds of video projects going, please make sure to support us on Patreon. Nobody has to, but the folks who are over there supporting us right now on Patreon help us to be able to do this as our full-time job, getting to work on this day in and day out to make sure that we are able to provide you all with the highest quality and most research news that we are able to. I've got to give a massive thanks to everyone on Patreon and the folks who are just watching in general who are not on Patreon, because each and every one of y'all make this channel possible, and we thank y'all greatly for listening to our news coverage, and also on this video in particular, a little bit of my limited commentary on my pro-American stances in the Middle East and also against the Russian Federation. But, nevertheless, commentary like that's very rarely provided. It's usually more so just news coverage and analysis. Nevertheless, I do thank you all so much once again for watching, and we will see you all in the next one.